We're going to pick up where we left off in the previous video, and that is to begin creating a shape around the edge of this object. Once I've finished creating the shape, I'll use an extrude or inflate type of brush. In the layer panel, I just created a new layer in order to separate this work onto its own. That way I can make adjustments to the depth level after the fact and not have it affect the other work if I don't want it to. Here I'm trying to apply the actual beveling by right-clicking on the spline, and then I choose brush along stroke. It was a little bit faint the first time, so I'm just trying different brush alphas and trying a few different depth levels and whatnot. So it's really just an experimental stage at this point. This time I went with extrude clay, which applies dynamic tessellation, and I think I'm going to leave it with that and move on to the cheek guards. I'm just going to hit the S key to turn symmetry back on, and I'm going to create a new layer for this. Once that's done, I'm going to check my brush alpha and change it. The next thing I'm going to do is go to the sculpture panel and right click on the layer in order to add some thickness by clicking extrude. That will give me a little bit more surface area to create my shape. And so when I select the closed spline, those new spline tools open up. I can choose which type of spline I want to work with, and right now I'm working with the normal spline where the curvature goes through the point. Okay, so I think I'm fairly happy with that. I'm trying to add some thickness to the main portion of the helmet. Again, I do that by right-clicking on the layer and choosing to extrude. Now we're going to work on beveling this object along the edges as well. This time I'm going to use the spline stroke draw mode from the E panel, which is an older version of the curves. It's the one I'm most used to, so I still like using it from time to time. With this type of spline, you can typically just hit the Enter key in order to apply the brush along the stroke. I think I'm fairly happy with that. Later on, I'll use the transform tool to adjust those cheek guards down, but for now I'm going to apply some additional detail to them. I start out by using the stamp draw mode, but I realized that my scale may be slightly off from instance to instance. Therefore, I switched to the movable stamp. That way it stays relatively static, but I can create multiple instances from them. Moving on from those, I'm going to work on creating some beveling on this one as well. And I'm going to use the spline stroke draw mode again on these. Once I've created my splines, I can just hit the Enter key and it will apply that stroke along the spline. Before finishing, I right-clicked on the layer to create an extrusion. And now I'm going to go back to the cheek guard and apply a little bit more decorative detail. I'm choosing one for a larger flourish and then a smaller flourish. I'm just experimenting at this point again. In this particular instance, I think the movable stamp rather than the regular stamp will give me a little bit more control because I can see exactly where I'm placing it, and I can use the 9 or 0 key on the keyboard in order to rotate it, or the bracket keys to increase the scale. I'm now looking for another flourish in order to add to the visor. Just too much blank space there. I can adjust the depth once I've created that by adjusting the depth slider on the scope layer. I'm now going to create a new sculpt layer in order to work on that hair or brush, whatever you want to call it, on top of the helmet. I'm just using some type of a hair brush alpha. And I'm not going for super realism in this demonstration. There's a lot more I could do. I would probably use the muscles tool or just try and do the fibers in a host application rather than trying to do it in a sculpt workspace. Again, I would probably spend more time and use slightly different techniques if I had to sculpt this particular part, but for now it'll suffice for demonstration purposes. Okay, we've done about all the detail work that we're going to do. I'm going to experiment now with the different shaders and just to try and see what it might look like when the finished product is done. We'll stop the video here and we're going to pick up in the next one where we will bake to our low polygon mesh. And before doing that, we'll set up our UVs and we'll also apply some smart materials along the way before we export to Blender. So stay tuned and we'll see you then.